Hey guys, tonight we begin with a very slow and quiet journey into the life of a man who may not have moved mountains or conquered kingdoms, but certainly conquered time. Settle and dim the lights, and let the soft hum of the Venetian canals wash over you. Tonight we float over to Murano Island, a place famous for glass but not for haste. Imagine the narrow stone streets that smell faintly of salt and wood smoke. Imagine the small flicker of a lantern, reflecting in the dark water, and somewhere in that glow Maestro Bernardo is waiting. Bernardo is not a man you would notice in a crowd. He is average in height, his hair peppered with gray and tied back in a loose knot. His eyes hold a kind of patience that borders on stubbornness. In a world that demands speed and noise, he chooses quiet and meticulous slowness. Every morning he steps into his workshop wearing a simple linen tunic and wooden slippers. No assistants, no apprentices, no chatter. Just him, the furnace, and the glass. The workshop itself is a narrow stone room with a low ceiling. Dust motes float lazily through thin shafts of sunlight and dance over the worn marble slab where Bernardo will spend most of the day. Shelves line the walls holding rods of glass in muted reds, blues, greens, and the occasional golden swirl. The furnace crackles and sighs like a living creature, and a faint smell of molten sand lingers in the air. Outside, a gondola glides silently over the canal water, but inside time moves according to Bernardo's own rhythm. His ritual begins at sunrise. He selects a single rod of crimson glass. The color is deep and patient. He places it in the furnace and lets the heat creep into the glass for exactly 42 minutes. Not 41, not 43, 42. During this time he does not speak. He does not hum. He does not pace. He stands or sits near the furnace, observing the subtle flickers of light in the molten rod as if it is a secret conversation meant only for him. After 42 minutes he removes the rod with careful tongs and begins the slow twist that will form a single bead. The bead is tiny yet infinitely intricate. Swirls of gold dance inside the crimson glass, forming patterns that would make the most talented Venetian noble gasp. Yet Bernardo does not rush. Each movement is deliberate. Each twist is deliberate. The bead grows slowly in his hands as though it has a soul that demands gentle persuasion. Once the bead is formed, he lays it on the marble slab. Then he waits. 6 hours pass and Bernardo does nothing but observe. He does not prod or touch the bead. He does not wipe the slab. He allows the heat of the workshop and the subtle vibrations of the furnace to bring the glass to a quiet equilibrium. By the end of the day, the bead is perfectly cooled, a tiny jewel born out of patience and solitude. Throughout these 11 hours, there is barely a sound. The soft whoosh of bellows, the occasional crackle of fire, and the distant call of a gondolier. Bernardo moves like a shadow around the workshop. He drinks from a small clay cup and eats a piece of stale bread, but even this is performed with extreme quiet. It is not a life for most. It is not a life of adventure or glory. But it is a life of discipline, a life of focus, and a life of subtle beauty. People sometimes ask why he does not make more beads in a day. Why not hire apprentices? Why not sell in bulk? Bernardo's answer is always the same. 1 bead per day. Anything else would be too loud, too hurried, too common. The world can have speed and noise and endless repetition. He prefers the slow and the rare. The bead becomes a meditation, a small monument to time itself. In the late afternoon, the canals glow with amber light, and the workshop seems to expand and contract with the flickering shadows. Bernardo steps back and observes the bead once more. There is a quiet pride in his eyes, not a desire for praise, but a satisfaction only he can feel. Outside the window, a child tosses breadcrumbs to the ducks, but Bernardo does not notice. Outside the window, a gondola passes and the water ripples. Bernardo does not notice. Inside his world is reduced to the bead, the furnace, and the slow, gentle rhythm of 11 hours. The sun begins to set, and the soft golden light washes over the crimson bead. Bernardo extinguishes the small lanterns around the workshop. The furnace hums one last low note and then begins to cool. Bernardo wipes his hands on his tunic and leans back against the marble slab. He does not speak. He does not move. He simply breathes and lets the quiet of Murano wrap around him. Tomorrow he will do the exact same thing. But tonight he rests in the knowledge that time has bent itself to his will and produced something small, perfect and utterly unrepeatable. And as Bernardo drifts into a light doze, a sudden unexpected sound comes from the furnace. A sharp crack echoes across the marble. The bead trembles ever so slightly as if it has a secret of its own. Bernardo freezes and stares at the tiny jewel that has occupied his world for 11 hours. And in that moment a question rises in the still air. Will tomorrow be exactly the same, or has the bead whispered something new into the glass and the fire? Right after that sudden crack, Bernardo felt a rare shiver of curiosity. The bead lay on the marble slab, its golden swirls catching the fading light. He reached for his tongs but paused. No words were spoken, no movement beyond the slow lift of his hand. For a moment the workshop felt larger than usual, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He leaned closer, examining the bead with the patience of decades. It was the same crimson shape, the same gold, but somehow different. There was a subtle shimmer, like a whisper, trapped inside the glass. He set the bead back down and let his eyes drift over the workshop. The furnace hummed a low and steady song, and the shadows of the shelves seemed to stretch. Bernardo could feel the rhythm of his own heartbeat, almost matching the gentle pulse of the fire. Outside, a gondola passed slowly, the ore dipping and lifting in perfect silence. He imagined the person inside, unaware of the miracle, in the small stone room just a few steps away. Bernardo would not disturb them, and the world would not intrude here. Tomorrow he would begin again. He would select another rod of crimson glass and repeat the 42-minute dance. But for now he allowed his thoughts to wander. It was a rare moment for him to consider what had come before. He remembered the day he first held molten glass, the sting of the furnace against his skin, and the awe he felt when the first bead formed, imperfect yet alive. He remembered his teacher long gone, who had whispered that time itself was the material of mastery. He had never understood it fully until now. As the evening deepened, a cold draft entered through a small gap in the stone wall. Bernardo did not close it. He liked the sound of the air mingling with the quiet sighs of the furnace. It reminded him that he was part of a larger world, one that continued to move even while he stayed anchored to his rhythm. His hands rested on the marble slab, tracing the edges of the bead without touching. He thought of all the people who would never know the name of Maestro Bernardo or the effort of a single bead. And he felt no sadness, only the calm contentment that comes from a life lived deliberately. The fire dimmed and the room darkened. Shadows grew long and soft across the walls, and the faint smell of molten sand lingered. Bernardo began to tidy his tools, slowly polishing the tongs and checking the rods of glass in their slots. Each rod had been selected carefully by hand over many years. Some colors were rare reds that burned bright in sunlight, others deep blues that reminded him of the canals at twilight. Each rod was a promise, a potential bead waiting for its time. Bernardo touched them gently, as though greeting an old friend. In the corner of the workshop, a small pile of cooled beads collected. They were all the same size and shape, yet no two were exactly alike. He sometimes wondered if anyone would ever notice the subtle differences. The slight bend in a gold swirl, or the faint uneven glow trapped in the crimson glass. But the thought of recognition did not matter. The beads existed for him, for the slow unfolding of the day, for the meditation of heat and patience. They existed because time itself needed witnesses. Suddenly, he remembered a conversation long ago with a visiting merchant who had asked how long it took to make one bead. Bernardo had answered simply 11 hours and left the man staring blankly. No one had asked again. People were accustomed to speed and repetition. They did not understand why someone would spend almost half a day for something so small. But Bernardo did not mind. He liked the silence of their misunderstanding, the invisible thread of curiosity that connected him to the world beyond the workshop. Night deepened outside, and the moon rose over the canals, casting pale light across the rooftops. The faint sound of water lapping against stone mingled with the slow rhythm of distant bells. Bernardo finally pulled his eyes from the bead and leaned back against the wall. For the first time he allowed himself to close his eyes and rest. Not sleep, not yet, but rest. The kind of quiet deep enough that the mind drifts, and yet attentive enough to catch the tiniest imperfection in a swirl of gold. He breathed slowly, feeling the day settle into his body. Just as his eyelids began to grow heavier, a tiny glimmer caught his attention. The bead on the marble slab seemed to move slightly. He blinked once, twice, and leaned closer. It was impossible. Glass did not move on its own. And yet, for a fraction of a second, the golden swirls shimmered differently, almost as if they had rearranged themselves inside the crimson core. Bernardo froze, his hand hovering above the bead. He could hear the faintest crackle from the furnace still cooling. He held his breath. Something was quietly unfolding inside the glass. And then, as quickly as it appeared, the shimmer vanished. The bead looked perfectly ordinary again. Yet Bernardo knew it was not. Something had shifted in a way he could not yet measure. Something had whispered in the heat and the slow hours of patience. A small quiet secret that only he could witness. And for the first time in decades, he felt a twinge of curiosity that was not fully disciplined or contained. It was a tiny spark, almost imperceptible, and yet alive in the silence of the workshop. He leaned back and let his thoughts drift into the canals and the faint echo of distant footsteps. What could tomorrow hold if even a single bead held a secret so carefully hidden in plain sight? He imagined the heat of the furnace, the twist of the rod, and the long, slow wait. Could the bead repeat its whisper, or was this a one-time anomaly? The thought lingered in the room, and Bernardo could almost hear it carried in the soft sigh of the fire. And then a small sound caught his attention. Not the furnace, not the canals, but something else. A soft, deliberate tapping at the edge of the workshop door. Bernardo froze. Who would come here at this hour who would disturb 11 hours of silence and patience? He rose slowly, hands steady, and moved toward the door. And as he reached for the handle, the tapping stopped. Silence returned. The moonlight glinted on the marble slab. The bead shimmered faintly again as if winking at him. Bernardo's hand hovered on the door, and he realized with a quiet shock that he was not entirely alone in this moment. Something or someone had chosen to arrive exactly when the workshop had reached the deepest point of stillness. Bernardo stood frozen for a moment longer. The door remained closed, and the tapping had stopped. The silence in the workshop felt heavier than before, as if it had absorbed the echo of whatever had arrived. He took a slow breath and reminded himself that this was a place of patience and observation. One bead per day, one step at a time. Nothing else mattered. Yet curiosity had a way of creeping in even in the most disciplined of hearts. He opened the door very slowly. Outside the narrow stone alley, the moonlight washed over uneven cobblestones. The air smelled faintly of salt and smoke, and the gentle lapping of the canal reached his ears. There was no one there. No shadow, no figure, no movement except the quiet ripple of water and a soft flutter of wind against the shuttered windows. Bernardo stepped outside and scanned the street carefully. The gondola in the distance moved silently like a shadow with no sound. Still nothing. Shrugging softly, he returned to the workshop. The bead lay on the marble slab as if nothing had happened. Yet Bernardo could not shake the feeling that the small shimmer he had seen was more than a trick of light. He adjusted the bead slightly and let it catch the faint moonlight. The golden swirls gleamed faintly. He tilted it again, and the crimson shimmer seemed to deepen. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, and yet enough to make him pause. Something about this single bead was different than any other he had made before. He cleaned his tools methodically and set them in order. The tongs were polished, the rods checked, and the marble slab wiped with a soft cloth. Even the furnace, now cooled completely, had a presence in the room. Bernardo moved slowly around it as though paying respect to a companion that had endured decades of quiet devotion. The workshop felt sacred. Not because anyone else would recognize it, but because it had been held for so long in the same steady rhythm. As he prepared to leave, he cast one last glance at the bead. The shimmer returned again, almost like a pulse. Bernardo could swear it moved deliberately this time. He knelt and observed it from every angle. The twist of gold inside seemed to shift subtly, forming a pattern that almost resembled something alive. He frowned slightly. Glass did not live. Glass did not breathe. And yet in his quiet, attentive observation he could almost imagine it did. Night deepened further and the shadows lengthened. Outside, the faint call of a night bird reached him. Bernardo felt the deep urge to close the shutters, but he left them open. He liked the way the soft moonlight reached the bead. It reminded him that even in his most solitary work, he was not entirely cut off from the world. The canals moved slowly beyond the stone walls. A gentle breeze brushed his face, and the workshop seemed to hum in response. He finally settled onto a small wooden stool beside the slab. Hands resting on his knees, he allowed his mind to drift. Thoughts were not rushed or organized. They were slow and quiet, like water settling after a storm. The shimmer of the beads seemed to speak to him, not with words but with presence. A quiet reminder that even in the repetition of a single day, the world could still surprise, and that patience was a kind of magic. He had not fully understood. Suddenly a small sound came again. Not a knock, not a tap, but a faint scrape, as if something had shifted inside the bead itself. Bernardo leaned closer. The bead's gold swirls were rearranging. A tiny spiral formed, and then another. He blinked once, and the spirals seemed almost to dance imperceptibly. He tried to breathe evenly to steady his thoughts. This was not something he had ever witnessed in decades of careful observation, and yet here it was. Subtle and silent, but undeniable. He reached out slowly with a gloved hand, just a touch to feel the cool surface of the marble. As his fingers hovered above the bead, the shimmer intensified. Gold swirls formed a shape that almost resembled a small spiral staircase winding downward. He froze. This was not a trick of moonlight. This was deliberate in its complexity, yet gentle in its movement. He could not explain it. He could not name it. And yet he felt a deep calm in witnessing it. The room seemed to hold its breath. Outside the canals where still the gentle night air mingled with the faint smell of smoke and salt. Bernardo sat silently for many minutes observing the bead. The furnace had cooled completely. The rods of glass rested in their slots. Yet this single bead seemed to carry life of its own. He could feel it in the quiet vibrations of the marble under his fingers, in the subtle light that flickered across its surface. He closed his eyes for a moment and imagined what tomorrow might bring. Another rod, another 42 minutes, another slow twist, and 6-hour wait. Would the bead repeat its whisper, or had it only chosen this night to speak? Bernardo could not know. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the work was not simply the creation of a bead, but the patience to witness something entirely unexpected within it. Just as he leaned back to rise, he heard it again. The softest sound, almost inaudible, like the faintest tap of a finger on the marble. Bernardo froze completely. The bead shimmered brighter than before. This was not an ordinary night. Something was quietly unfolding in the workshop that had not occurred in all the years he had labored here. And as his hand moved to reach toward the bead, a subtle warmth seemed to rise from the marble itself, as if the bead had drawn a tiny piece of the furnace into itself. And in that moment he realized that the single bead that had defined his life for decades was no longer just a bead. It was something else, something he could not name, something that had chosen him as its witness. And as he leaned closer to examine it, the golden spirals began to shift once more, forming a shape that he had never seen before. The movement was deliberate, subtle, and quiet, but it carried a weight he could feel deep in his chest. Bernardo leaned even closer to the bead. The golden spirals shifted again, but this time they seemed to form a pattern that suggested depth. He could almost imagine looking down a tiny spiral staircase inside the glass. It was absurd and impossible, and yet his eyes refused to lie. The bead held something beyond its physical form, beyond the slow hours of labor that had created it. For the first time in decades, he felt a flicker of wonder that was not restrained by habit or ritual. He straightened slowly and surveyed the workshop. The furnace was cold now, the rods of glass lined up in their slots, and the marble slab glimmered faintly in the moonlight. Everything was as it should be, yet nothing felt ordinary. Bernardo ran a hand along the edge of the slab, as if to anchor himself. The workshop had been a place of repetition for so long, and now repetition felt fragile, and fragile felt alive. He breathed slowly. Patience had brought him here, and now it demanded that he witness the impossible. He moved to a small wooden stool and sat down again. His eyes remained fixed on the bead. The spirals shifted yet again, and for a moment they formed a shape that reminded him of a tiny labyrinth. He imagined a minuscule traveler moving through the glass, following the curves and turns of the golden lines. He almost laughed softly at the thought. A man who had spent 11 hours a day for decades now imagining a bead with a tiny traveler inside. The absurdity was perfect. Outside the workshop, the canals reflected the pale light of the moon. A gondola glided silently across the water, and the faint smell of salt and wood smoke mingled in the air. Bernardo allowed himself to drift for a moment, imagining what it would be like if the bead could speak. Not in words, but in whispers of heat and light. The thought made him smile faintly. Perhaps that was what he had been waiting for all these years. Not recognition, not fame, but the quiet possibility that his work might one day surprise even him. The bead shimmered subtly. He leaned forward again and traced the spirals with the tip of his gloved finger hovering just above the surface. The golden lines shifted once more, forming patterns that seemed almost intentional. He could not explain it. It was not magic in the usual sense, nor was it any trick of the eye. It was something different. A slow, deliberate unfolding of a secret that had chosen to reveal itself at the end of the day when the workshop was quiet and the world outside had paused. Time seemed to stretch. Bernardo lost track of minutes and hours. He felt neither hunger nor fatigue. His mind had quieted into a stillness he had not experienced before. Outside, the gentle lap of water and the faint call of night birds reached him intermittently, but did not disturb his focus. The bead was a universe unto itself, and he was the only witness. He allowed his eyes to follow the golden spirals as they twisted and shifted, forming tiny, impossible geometries. Suddenly he noticed a faint vibration from the marble slab. It was imperceptible, almost too small to register. He froze. The bead seemed to respond to something beyond the furnace, beyond his observation. The tiny golden spirals pulsed faintly in rhythm with the vibration. He blinked and adjusted his position. Could the bead be aware of him in some way, or was it merely an effect of light and heat and imagination? Bernardo was not a man to indulge illusions, but even he could not dismiss what he saw. He leaned back and allowed himself to breathe slowly. A faint warmth radiated from the bead into his hand, even though he did not touch it. The spirals shifted again, and he imagined a tiny river flowing inside the glass, tracing every curve and twist of the golden lines. He felt a quiet thrill that had nothing to do with excitement and everything to do with witnessing something wholly unique. A single bead had become an entire world inside which he could imagine stories and movements that defied comprehension. The moon moved across the sky. The workshop darkened further and the shadows lengthened. Bernardo remained seated, observing the bead. There was no urgency, no hurry, no desire to complete anything, only attention, only patience. Only the quiet awe of seeing something slow and deliberate and entirely unexpected. For decades he had labored to make beads, and now the bead was laboring to reveal something to him. Then the softest sound reached his ears. Not from the canals, not from the distant bells, but from within the workshop. A faint scratch, almost imperceptible, like a tiny claw moving across marble. Bernardo held his breath. The bead shimmered once again. The golden spirals seemed to coil more tightly, as if responding to the sound. He could not see a source. He could not explain it. And yet he felt the pulse of the bead echoing faintly through the air and the stone under his hands. He leaned closer still. The spirals now formed a complex shape that almost resembled a small tower coiling infinitely upward. Bernardo could not name it. He could not understand it. And yet he felt that if he watched long enough, the bead might reveal more. He wondered for a moment if anyone else in the world would understand such a thing. Perhaps not. Perhaps this secret was meant only for him in the quiet of his workshop in the slow hours of the night. And then, just as he was about to look away, a sudden movement caught his eye. The bead shimmered sharply, and one of the golden spirals uncoiled slightly like a ribbon moving in water. Bernardo froze. He leaned closer. Outside, the moonlight glinted on the marble slab. The workshop seemed impossibly still. And in that stillness, the bead began to pulse once more, as if breathing slowly and deliberately in the silence of the room. Bernardo sat very still. The bead pulsed in the faint moonlight, as if it had a rhythm of its own. He leaned closer, feeling a quiet curiosity he had not allowed himself in decades. The spirals shifted again, forming shapes that almost resembled doors and tiny corridors inside the glass. It was impossible and absurd, and yet entirely mesmerizing. The workshop seemed to grow smaller around him, as if it too was drawn into the slow unfolding of this tiny miracle. He reached out cautiously with a gloved hand, but stopped just above the surface of the marble. The warmth emanating from the bead increased subtly. It was not hot in any ordinary sense. It was a gentle insistence, an almost tactile invitation to watch and wait. Bernardo let his hand hover there for long moments. The world outside ceased to matter. The faint lapping of canal water, the distant toll of bells, the occasional night bird became background noise to the quiet drama of glass and patience. He remembered the first bead he had ever made. It had been lopsided and imperfect. He had spent hours staring at it, convinced it held no value. And yet it had taught him the rhythm of the furnace, the slow patience of heat, and the subtle rewards of still observation. Now, decades later, a single bead pulsed with quiet life. And he understood more clearly than ever that creation and observation were intertwined. One without the other yielded nothing. The spirals inside the bead began to shift again. Bernardo imagined a tiny staircase winding downwards inside the crimson glass. He imagined a figure descending carefully along the golden steps, exploring the curves and corridors. The thought made him smile faintly. He could not explain it. He could not prove it. And yet he felt the thrill of discovery without movement, without urgency, without consequence. A universe existed here inside his solitary workshop, and he was the only witness. Outside, the faint reflection of moonlight on the canals flickered. Bernardo allowed his eyes to relax, but kept attention on the bead. The spirals now seemed to respond to subtle changes in his own breathing. He wondered if this was his mind playing tricks or something more. Perhaps it did not matter. Perhaps the value lay not in understanding, but in the act of noticing and the patience of the gaze in the slow unfolding of a tiny impossible event. The night deepened. Shadows crept along the walls, stretching the shelves of rods and jars. Bernardo sipped a small cup of water but did not move from the stool. His world had contracted to the bead, the slab, and the quiet rhythm of the furnace that still held the memory of heat. For the first time he felt a connection that transcended the laborious routine of decades. He was not merely a maker. He was a witness. The bead had chosen to reveal itself, and he had the patience to see. Then a soft sound reached him from the corner of the workshop. Not the furnace, not the canals, not the moonlit streets. Something small and deliberate, as if a tiny foot had stepped on marble. Bernardo froze. His eyes darted across the room. Nothing moved. Yet the bead shimmered sharply in response to the sound. The golden spirals coiled tighter as if bracing or acknowledging a presence unseen. He leaned forward. This was not part of his routine. This was something else. Something alive within the quiet. He stood slowly and circled the slab. Each step careful, measured, deliberate. The bead pulsed softly as he moved. The spirals shifted once again, forming patterns that seemed to suggest small chambers and hidden corners. He felt an almost imperceptible thrill. He had seen countless beads in his life, each carefully made with identical precision. And yet none had ever hinted at this level of subtle life. This tiny universe was secret and profound in its impossibility. Bernardo paused and rested his hands lightly on the edge of the slab. He imagined the heat of the furnace, the long 42 minutes of patience, the 6 hours of cooling. All of it seemed to have conspired to bring this moment into existence. The bead was no longer merely a bead. It was the embodiment of a slow and deliberate universe. He could not predict its movements, nor could he control them. His role was to observe, to witness, to acknowledge the quiet miracle that had appeared in the solitude of his labor. The moon moved higher in the sky. The workshop grew darker. Bernardo leaned forward once again. The spirals inside the bead were now coiling and uncoiling in a pattern almost like breathing. He could feel it in the cool marble under his palms. His eyes followed each tiny movement. He imagined a figure walking through the tiny corridors, tracing the curves of the golden spirals, as if exploring a hidden city of light and crimson glass. He smiled faintly at the thought. Only here, only now could such things exist. And then the bead pulsed one last time sharply. The golden spirals formed a shape that seemed to leap out of the crimson glass for a fleeting second. Bernardo blinked and leaned closer. Outside, the faint sound of canal water and distant bells was replaced by an almost imperceptible hum emanating from the marble itself. The workshop seemed to vibrate subtly, as if acknowledging the extraordinary. And as Bernardo reached out his gloved hand to hover again above the bead, he realized with quiet shock that the bead was no longer entirely passive. Something had awoken within it. Bernardo sat very still. The bead pulsed in the faint moonlight, as if it had a rhythm of its own. He leaned closer, feeling a quiet curiosity he had not allowed himself in decades. The spirals shifted again, forming shapes that almost resembled doors and tiny corridors inside the glass. It was impossible and absurd, and yet entirely mesmerizing. The workshop seemed to grow smaller around him, as if it too was drawn into the slow unfolding of this tiny miracle. He reached out cautiously with a gloved hand, but stopped just above the surface of the marble. The warmth emanating from the bead increased subtly. It was not hot in any ordinary sense. It was a gentle insistence, an almost tactile invitation to watch and wait. Bernardo let his hand hover there for long moments. The world outside ceased to matter. The faint lapping of canal water, the distant toll of bells, the occasional night bird became background noise to the quiet drama of glass and patience. He remembered the first bead he had ever made. It had been lopsided and imperfect. He had spent hours staring at it, convinced it held no value. And yet it had taught him the rhythm of the furnace, the slow patience of heat, and the subtle rewards of still observation. Now, decades later, a single bead pulsed with quiet life, and he understood more clearly than ever that creation and observation were intertwined. One without the other yielded nothing. The spirals inside the bead began to shift again. Bernardo imagined a tiny staircase winding downwards inside the crimson glass. He imagined a figure descending carefully along the golden steps, exploring the curves and corridors. The thought made him smile faintly. He could not explain it. He could not prove it. And yet he felt the thrill of discovery without movement, without urgency, without consequence. A universe existed here inside his solitary workshop, and he was the only witness. Outside, the faint reflection of moonlight on the canals flickered. Bernardo allowed his eyes to relax, but kept attention on the bead. The spirals now seemed to respond to subtle changes in his own breathing. He wondered if this was his mind playing tricks or something more. Perhaps it did not matter. Perhaps the value lay not in understanding, but in the act of noticing and the patience of the gaze in the slow unfolding of a tiny impossible event. The night deepened. Shadows crept along the walls, stretching the shelves of rods and jars. Bernardo sipped a small cup of water but did not move from the stool. His world had contracted to the bead, the slab, and the quiet rhythm of the furnace that still held the memory of heat. For the first time he felt a connection that transcended the laborious routine of decades. He was not merely a maker. He was a witness. The bead had chosen to reveal itself, and he had the patience to see. Then a soft sound reached him from the corner of the workshop. Not the furnace, not the canals, not the moonlit streets. Something small and deliberate, as if a tiny foot had stepped on marble. Bernardo froze. His eyes darted across the room. Nothing moved. Yet the bead shimmered sharply in response to the sound. The golden spirals coiled tighter as if bracing or acknowledging a presence unseen. He leaned forward. This was not part of his routine. This was something else. Something alive within the quiet. He stood slowly and circled the slab. Each step careful, measured, deliberate. The bead pulsed softly as he moved. The spirals shifted once again, forming patterns that seemed to suggest small chambers and hidden corners. He felt an almost imperceptible thrill. He had seen countless beads in his life, each carefully made with identical precision. And yet none had ever hinted at this level of subtle life. This tiny universe was secret and profound in its impossibility. Bernardo paused and rested his hands lightly on the edge of the slab. He imagined the heat of the furnace, the long 42 minutes of patience, the 6 hours of cooling. All of it seemed to have conspired to bring this moment into existence. The bead was no longer merely a bead. It was the embodiment of a slow and deliberate universe. He could not predict its movements, nor could he control them. His role was to observe, to witness, to acknowledge the quiet miracle that had appeared in the solitude of his labor. The moon moved higher in the sky. The workshop grew darker. Bernardo leaned forward once again. The spirals inside the bead were now coiling and uncoiling in a pattern almost like breathing. He could feel it in the cool marble under his palms. His eyes followed each tiny movement. He imagined a figure walking through the tiny corridors, tracing the curves of the golden spirals, as if exploring a hidden city of light and crimson glass. He smiled faintly at the thought. Only here, only now could such things exist. And then the bead pulsed one last time sharply. The golden spirals formed a shape that seemed to leap out of the crimson glass for a fleeting second. Bernardo blinked and leaned closer. Outside, the faint sound of canal water and distant bells was replaced by an almost imperceptible hum emanating from the marble itself. The workshop seemed to vibrate subtly, as if acknowledging the extraordinary. And as Bernardo reached out his gloved hand to hover again above the bead, he realized with quiet shock that the bead was no longer entirely passive. Something had awoken within it. Bernardo froze with his hand hovering over the marble. The bead pulsed faintly, as if responding to his presence. The golden spirals shifted again, and now he could almost see shapes forming inside. Tiny corridors and arches winding impossibly into themselves. He wondered if his eyes were playing tricks, but deep in his chest he felt the unmistakable weight of a subtle truth. Something was quietly alive in the bead. Something patient and deliberate. He sat down once again on the wooden stool. The workshop seemed impossibly still. The furnace had cooled completely, but the air hummed with the memory of heat. The moonlight danced faintly across the crimson glass, and the golden spirals shimmered with a pulse that was almost imperceptible. Bernardo allowed his eyes to follow each twist and turn. His breathing slowed. He let himself become a part of the stillness rather than merely an observer. Outside, the canals reflected the silver moon, and the faint lapping of water echoed softly through the narrow streets. Bernardo imagined the world beyond the workshop, moving in its usual hurried rhythm, oblivious to what he was witnessing. Speed and noise and endless repetition. They would never notice the subtle universe inside a single bead. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps beauty and mystery existed most fully when no one was watching. The spirals inside the bead shifted again. Bernardo leaned closer. Now he could see tiny chambers forming that seemed impossibly real. He imagined a figure moving through the miniature labyrinth, tracing the golden lines along the curves of the crimson glass. It was absurd. It was impossible. And yet entirely mesmerizing. He felt a faint thrill that had nothing to do with excitement, and everything to do with witnessing something that could only exist here and now. The faintest vibration passed through the marble slab. Bernardo noticed it immediately. It was so subtle he might have missed it if not for the attention that had sharpened over decades. The bead shimmered in response, and the spirals moved with deliberate precision. He wondered if it was communicating something. Not in words, but in presence. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply observed, letting the rhythm of the bead dictate the pace of his mind. Time became fluid. Minutes lost meaning. Hours seemed to stretch and condense simultaneously. The bead pulsed gently as if breathing. Bernardo leaned closer and allowed his thoughts to drift along the curves and corridors of the tiny universe inside. He imagined tiny stairs winding downwards into golden chambers, imagined corridors that led nowhere and everywhere all at once. The absurdity of it made him smile faintly. Only here could such things exist. Suddenly a soft sound echoed from the corner of the workshop. Not the furnace. Not the canals. Something delicate and deliberate, as if a small creature had stepped lightly across the stone floor. Bernardo froze. His eyes darted across the room, but nothing moved. And yet the bead shimmered sharply in response. The golden spirals coiled tighter, almost acknowledging the presence. He leaned forward. This was not ordinary. This was alive in a way he could not explain. He rested his hands lightly on the marble slab. The bead pulsed rhythmically, subtly, as if synchronizing with the vibration of the stone. Bernardo imagined that the tiny universe inside might be aware of him, waiting for his gaze to follow the spirals and corridors. He felt a quiet reverence that had little to do with fear and much to do with attention. Patience had carried him here, and patience demanded he continue to watch. The moonlight shifted slightly as clouds passed overhead. Shadows lengthened along the stone walls. Bernardo did not move from the stool. He let the bead dictate the rhythm of the workshop. Each pulse of light, each shift of the golden spirals carried him deeper into the quiet. Outside, the world went on unobserved, and he did not care. He had a universe inside his hands, and it demanded nothing from him except the slow attention he had cultivated over decades. The bead shimmered again, and for a fleeting moment, Bernardo thought he saw a figure moving within. Tiny golden limbs tracing the spirals, descending and ascending as though exploring hidden chambers. He blinked slowly. Could it be real? Could it even matter? He realized it did not matter. The magic was in the observation itself, in the patient attention, in the slow unfolding of a secret that had chosen him alone to witness. Then the shimmer intensified sharply. The golden spirals coiled rapidly, forming shapes that suggested something emerging from within the crimson core. Bernardo leaned closer instinctively. His heart beat quietly but steadily. The workshop seemed impossibly still, as if holding its breath. He had seen many beads over his lifetime, but never one that pulsed with deliberate, subtle life. And now he understood that tomorrow would not be ordinary either. Something had begun that could not be ignored. As he leaned forward, the bead shifted once more. The tiny spirals twisted in a new pattern. Bernardo noticed a faint warmth rising from the marble. It was not hot. It was gentle, deliberate, almost like an invitation. He felt a quiet thrill run through him. The bead had awakened. It had been patient. It had been silent. And now it was speaking slowly in the only language it had: movement, shimmer, and the quiet pulse of a hidden life. Bernardo remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the bead. The golden spirals moved with an elegance he had never witnessed before. They twisted and coiled as if alive, forming patterns that suggested chambers and corridors deeper than he could imagine. He felt the pull of attention like a gentle tide, drawing him into the crimson glass. Each pulse of shimmer carried a weight that was almost tangible, a slow insistence that demanded careful observation. The workshop itself seemed to grow smaller. Shadows clung to the walls, and the rods of glass rested silently in their slots, untouched and still. The furnace had long cooled, but the air hummed faintly with memory, carrying the subtle warmth of long hours of heat. Bernardo breathed slowly, almost in time with the pulse of the bead. Time seemed irrelevant. Minutes stretched. Hours dissolved. The outside world, the canals, the distant bells, everything melted away. He reached out his gloved hand again, but paused just above the marble. The bead pulsed brighter, almost aware of his presence. The golden spirals shifted more deliberately, this time forming a pattern that suggested movement downward like a staircase curling infinitely. He imagined a tiny traveler exploring the delicate corridors, a silent figure wandering through this secret universe. He smiled faintly, a quiet amusement at the absurdity and impossibility of the thought. The bead shimmered again. This time the spirals formed loops and arches that seemed almost architectural, impossibly precise for something that was mere glass. Bernardo leaned closer, his face inches from the marble. He could feel the subtle warmth radiating from the bead, an invitation to witness, a quiet insistence that something was unfolding that required full attention. He realized that for decades he had been patient, but this patience had a reward he had never expected. A faint scratch sounded somewhere in the workshop, soft enough that he almost missed it. The bead responded immediately, the golden spirals twisting rapidly as if acknowledging the sound. Bernardo's eyes widened slightly. No one was there. No one could be there. And yet the bead pulsed as if alive, a slow, deliberate heartbeat hidden in the crimson and gold. He felt a shiver of wonder and a deeper calm at the same time. This was no ordinary work, this was something entirely new. He rested his hands lightly on the marble slab. The pulse continued, subtle and deliberate. The spirals seemed to coil and uncoil in quiet conversation, forming patterns that were intricate and impossible to trace. Bernardo allowed himself to breathe with the rhythm, his mind merging with the slow unfolding of the bead's secret. The absurdity of it made him smile again. Only here, only now, could such a universe exist entirely for him, entirely unseen by the outside world. The moonlight shifted as clouds passed, faintly illuminating the workshop with moving shadows. The spirals inside the bead pulsed brighter, as if the light itself spoke to them. Bernardo imagined that the tiny corridors were being explored, mapped by invisible travelers moving in perfect silence. He leaned closer and allowed his imagination to drift, unhurried, unforced. The bead had awakened. It was no longer passive. It was deliberate, subtle, alive in a way that defied explanation. Time continued to stretch. Bernardo forgot the passage of hours. The workshop, the canals, the distant night all faded into a background hum. He felt no hunger, no fatigue, only attention, only the quiet absorption into a single act of observation. The bead's golden spirals shifted again, forming loops that suggested infinite possibilities. Each movement was slow, deliberate, almost musical in its timing. Bernardo was no longer a maker. He was a witness, and the bead demanded nothing more. Then suddenly the pulse changed. A sharper shimmer ran through the crimson glass and the spirals twisted in a new pattern. Bernardo leaned forward instinctively. The bead seemed to thrum with life. He could feel it faintly through the marble, a warmth that was gentle and deliberate. It was no longer merely a bead. It had become something entirely different, a quiet universe, and he was its only observer. The workshop held its breath with him. And just as he thought he could finally understand, the bead shifted once more. The spirals aligned into a pattern that suggested motion upward this time, a rising rather than descending movement. Bernardo froze. He realized that whatever had awakened in the bead had not finished. It had chosen tonight, chosen him, and would not be fully revealed until he paid attention without haste. His hand hovered over the marble, caught between the instinct to touch and the discipline to observe. In the quiet, the moonlight, the faint warmth, Bernardo understood that the bead was no longer a creation. It was a companion, a secret alive in silence, and it had decided that he was ready to witness what it had concealed for so long. And as he leaned in closer, a subtle vibration passed through the marble beneath his hands. A soft, deliberate pulse that spoke more than words ever could. Bernardo leaned closer to the bead. The spirals pulsed with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. He could see shapes now that he had never imagined. Tiny arches coiled around each other, corridors wound through invisible chambers, and patterns emerged that seemed impossibly precise. He realized that for decades he had thought of beads as objects of beauty. Now he understood that they could contain secrets. Slow, patient secrets hidden in plain sight. The marble under his hands seemed to hum softly with the pulse of the bead. Bernardo held his breath and allowed himself to watch. Time became a faint suggestion. Outside the narrow windows, the canals reflected silver moonlight. Distant bells rang occasionally, but their sound felt separate from the workshop. Everything had been reduced to the single bead, the tiny universe inside it, and the patient observer. He imagined a figure walking along the golden spirals inside the crimson glass. Tiny footsteps tracing the curves and coils, moving carefully through chambers and stairways that could exist only in imagination. It was absurd. It was impossible. And yet the illusion was beautiful, and he allowed himself to indulge it. The bead pulsed again, subtly, as if acknowledging his attention, as if inviting him to follow further into its hidden world. Bernardo shifted slightly, leaning on the marble slab. The bead shimmered faintly, and a warmth radiated into his palms. It was not heat, but presence. Something deliberate and alive. He had spent decades mastering the slow creation of beads, understanding the exact moment of twisting the glass and the patient wait for cooling. And yet, this bead had done something he had never anticipated. It had awakened within itself a quiet life. The spirals twisted again, forming shapes that suggested a journey upwards this time. Tiny arcs and loops created a sense of elevation, of moving through an invisible cathedral of glass. Bernardo blinked slowly. He could not name what he was seeing. He could not explain it, and yet the beauty of it was undeniable. He allowed himself to drift with the movement, following the pulse of the bead as one might follow a river to its source. A faint sound reached him from the far corner of the workshop. It was so soft he almost missed it. The bead pulsed sharply in response. Bernardo froze. There was no one else in the room. Nothing moved except the spirals inside the crimson glass. He leaned closer, entranced. The subtle pulse grew stronger. The marble beneath his hands vibrated faintly, as if resonating with the heartbeat of the bead itself. He had never experienced anything like it. The moonlight shifted slightly. Shadows moved across the walls. Bernardo breathed slowly and watched the golden spirals twist and untwist. Tiny corridors opened and closed as if rearranging themselves. He realized that no amount of skill or patience could have produced this. This was beyond craft. This was beyond his understanding, and yet he felt calm, almost reassured. The bead was patient. It had waited all these years for the right moment. Time passed quietly. Minutes lost meaning. Hours became an abstract notion. Bernardo felt his mind slow to match the rhythm of the bead. He imagined explorers moving inside the tiny golden spirals. He imagined hidden chambers that could never exist outside of the glass. And he realized that the bead was teaching him something. Not through words, but through attention, through the quiet patience of observation, through the slow unfolding of the impossible. Suddenly the bead shimmered brightly. The golden spirals formed shapes that suggested life. Tiny movements within the crimson core made him blink. He could swear he saw something emerging, something deliberate, something entirely unexpected. Bernardo's hands hovered above the marble. The pulse continued. The spirals twisted and formed patterns he could not trace. He understood that the bead had chosen him to witness something extraordinary. And then a faint vibration ran through the floor. The bead pulsed sharply in response. Bernardo's heart beat quietly but steadily. He leaned forward. The golden spirals formed a new pattern, delicate and deliberate, as if hinting at a secret hidden in plain sight. He realized that the bead was no longer just a creation. It was a companion. It had awakened. And it had waited decades for someone patient enough to notice. Bernardo sat in quiet awe. The bead pulsed gently beneath the moonlight. The golden spirals coiled and uncoiled with deliberate precision, forming tiny chambers and corridors that seemed impossibly deep. He leaned closer, his gloved hands hovering over the marble. The warmth was subtle but insistent. He could feel it in the fingertips of his imagination, a delicate insistence that demanded attention. The bead had become more than glass. It had become alive. He traced the spirals with his eyes, moving slowly along the tiny arcs, following the impossible paths within the crimson core. Each pulse seemed to shift the structure inside, forming new shapes that had not existed a moment before. Bernardo realized he had spent decades making beads that were beautiful and precise. And yet, none had ever contained this quiet, deliberate life, this subtle narrative that unfolded without haste. Without hurry, only with patient attention. Outside the narrow windows, the canals reflected the silver moon. The water lapped faintly against stone. A gondola passed silently in the distance. And yet all of it seemed irrelevant to Bernardo. Nothing existed beyond this bead in this moment. The bead pulsed softly, almost like breathing. He imagined a figure moving inside, climbing the golden spirals, exploring chambers and stairways, turning corners and tracing invisible paths. He smiled faintly. Only here, only now, could such a universe exist. The spirals shifted again, forming loops and arches that suggested architecture impossible in the ordinary world. Bernardo leaned forward, captivated. He realized that for decades he had trained himself to notice small shifts, subtle changes in glass, the faintest variation in color or shape. And now those skills had prepared him for this moment, to witness something that defied explanation. The bead had chosen him as its observer, and he was ready. A soft sound echoed through the workshop. Not the canals, not the furnace, not the distant bells. Something delicate, deliberate, like the movement of a tiny creature on marble. Bernardo froze. The bead pulsed sharply in response. The spirals twisted rapidly as if acknowledging the presence. He looked around but saw nothing. And yet the tiny universe inside the bead responded with life, with intention. He leaned closer. This was no ordinary object. This was something deliberate, patient, alive. The moonlight shifted again. Shadows danced across the shelves, across rods of glass lined in precise order. Bernardo let his eyes follow the spirals. The patterns moved slowly, almost like breathing. He imagined the tiny corridors stretching infinitely, the golden arches climbing upward, forming structures within the crimson glass that defied gravity and reason. He felt a faint thrill that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with observation, patience, and attention. Time lost meaning entirely. Hours blended together. Bernardo felt neither hunger nor fatigue. Only the pulse of the bead mattered. The marble hummed faintly under his hands. The spirals twisted delicately, forming shapes he could not name. Each shift was deliberate, precise, and gentle. He understood that this was not simply glass. This was a living narrative unfolding silently in his workshop, witnessed only by him, understood only by patience and careful attention. Then the bead shimmered sharply. The golden spirals aligned into a pattern that seemed to rise and coil simultaneously, suggesting upward movement and descent at once. Bernardo leaned closer, fascinated. He could feel a subtle warmth radiating from the marble, a quiet insistence that demanded observation. He realized that he was no longer simply a craftsman. He was a witness to something entirely new, entirely deliberate, and entirely alive. And just as he was about to lean closer, still a sudden sharp pulse ran through the bead. The spirals twisted violently, then settled into a delicate alignment that suggested something was emerging. Bernardo froze completely. His heart beat quietly but steadily. The bead pulsed gently again, and he understood that whatever had awakened within it had not finished revealing itself. This was the culmination of decades of patience. A secret the bead had carried quietly until now. He leaned closer still. The golden spirals shifted one final time for this night, forming a shape that seemed almost to reach out to him. The warmth beneath his hands intensified slightly but remained gentle. The workshop was impossibly still, the canals silent beyond the walls. Bernardo realized with quiet wonder that the bead had chosen him for this night. It had waited decades to reveal its secret in the slowest, most deliberate way imaginable. And now he was ready to see what had been hidden all along. Bernardo leaned in closer than ever. The bead pulsed softly beneath his eyes. The golden spirals had shifted again, forming delicate shapes that suggested movement and life. He could trace them with his gaze, following corridors, arches, and impossible stairways curling endlessly within the crimson glass. For a long moment he simply watched. Nothing rushed. Nothing demanded. The bead unfolded itself gently as though it had always existed in this perfect patience. He rested his hands lightly on the marble. The warmth beneath his palms was subtle but insistent. He realized that for decades he had labored on the slowest tasks, turning glass, heating rods, waiting for hours. And yet none of those hours had prepared him for the quiet wonder of this single bead. It had become more than creation. It had become a companion, a universe, a secret whispered only to him in the stillness of the workshop. The spirals twisted delicately, forming patterns that suggested chambers rising and descending at once. Bernardo imagined tiny figures exploring the spaces. Tiny travelers climbing golden steps, tracing corridors that existed only within the glass. He blinked slowly. He could not explain what he was seeing. He could not name it. But he understood that understanding was not the point. Witnessing was... Patience had prepared him for this. Attention had prepared him for this. And now the bead demanded nothing more than quiet observation. Outside the workshop, the canals were silent. The moonlight reflected faintly on the ripples. Bernardo allowed his eyes to follow the spirals, tracing impossible paths with steady breathing. The bead pulsed again. The warmth beneath his hands shifted subtly. It was deliberate. It was gentle. It was alive in a way that defied description. He realized that he had spent decades working with glass, yet this single bead had taught him more than all the others combined. A faint sound reached him. Something delicate, almost imperceptible, as if a small creature had stepped lightly across the marble. The bead pulsed sharply in response. Bernardo froze. The golden spirals twisted rapidly, forming intricate patterns that seemed to acknowledge the sound. No one was there. Nothing moved. Yet the tiny universe inside the crimson glass responded with life. He leaned closer. This was no longer mere observation. This was communion with something slow and deliberate and alive. Time became fluid. Minutes dissolved into hours. The spirals shifted continuously, forming corridors, chambers, arches, loops that seemed to move with intent. Bernardo leaned forward, watching the bead as he had never watched anything before. He realized that it was teaching him something he had never known. Not about glass, not about craft, but about patience, about attention, about the quiet rewards of absolute stillness. The bead pulsed again, brighter this time. The golden spirals coiled in ways that suggested motion outward and inward at once. Bernardo felt a subtle warmth rising through the marble and into his hands. He did not move. He did not breathe quickly. He allowed himself to simply exist with the bead, to witness its quiet unfolding. The workshop seemed impossibly still, holding its breath with him. Outside, the world was gone. Only the bead remained, alive and deliberate, whispering in its own secret language. And then the spirals shifted one last time for the night. They aligned perfectly, forming a pattern that suggested completeness without end. Bernardo felt a quiet thrill that was neither fear nor excitement, but recognition. The bead had revealed its secret, not in words, not in shape alone, but in the slow pulse, the warmth, the deliberate life it carried within itself. It had waited decades. It had chosen him. It had spoken in the only language it knew, patience and presence. He leaned back slightly and allowed himself to smile faintly. The bead shimmered once more, and then settled into gentle stillness. The golden spirals were coiled and serene. Bernardo felt the depth of what he had witnessed, a universe in miniature, a secret alive in silence. He understood that tomorrow he would heat the rod for 42 minutes, twist the glass, let it cool for 6 hours. The rhythm would continue, and yet nothing would ever be ordinary again. Outside, the moonlight lingered softly on the canals. The workshop was quiet. The bead rested on the marble slab like a sleeping creature. Bernardo rose slowly and moved to close the shutters. His gaze lingered once more on the crimson glass. He felt a connection that defied words. He had been a craftsman. He had been patient. And now he was a witness to a tiny secret universe that would exist only in his careful observation. He stepped back and breathed deeply. The workshop hummed faintly with memory of the day. He realized that the bead, this single bead, had changed everything. Not by moving mountains or creating spectacle, but by existing slowly, deliberately, patiently, revealing its secret only to the one who could watch. Bernardo smiled once more, quietly, gently, and allowed the workshop to fall into the deepest silence it had ever known. And as he turned away, the faintest shimmer ran through the bead. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply watched. The bead pulsed with the quiet life it had always carried. And Bernardo understood that in the slowest hours of his life he had witnessed something extraordinary, something that no one else would ever know, a single bead that held a universe within. In the quiet corners of a dim Venetian workshop, Maestro Bernardo spends 11 hours a day crafting a single crimson bead. Decades of patience, repetition, and silent devotion culminate in a tiny universe hidden within glass. alive with delicate golden spirals and impossible corridors. Through his unwavering attention, Bernardo discovers that even the smallest act can hold infinite wonder, patience can reveal secrets, and beauty exists in the slowest moments. This is a story of quiet magic, subtle discovery, and the extraordinary hidden in the ordinary. Subscribe to Stories Before Sleep and let these slow, mesmerizing tales guide you into calm, wonder-filled nights. Don't miss the magic waiting in every story.